AI taking over, being able to replace humans. I need your thoughts on this.
This is cultural evolution. Evolution is a search algorithm, and it's one of the least efficient search algorithms ever created. You figure out how to do these things well, and you survive. You don't figure out how to do it well, and you don't.
Benjamin Kuipers, MIT PhD.
His research is in artificial intelligence and robotics, currently investigating ethics as a foundational domain of knowledge for AIs that may act as members of human society.
Do you see the proliferation of AI too soon being problematic?
It's a tool. We might use it for good, we might use it for ill. The world has largely already been taken over by artificially intelligent creatures, which are corporations. The role of a corporation is to maximize its profits. Cooperation and trust is critical. Ethics helps create cooperation, and cooperation is what gives us positive sum returns. Have courage about your ability to change things for the better.
So in this book I'm working on, one of the points I argue to make that happen is we have to change our minds.
Yes.
And
yes.
One of the most popular individuals philosophizing on how do we change our minds as society is this individual named Michael Pollan, and he makes this point of psychedelic therapy and psychedelic assisted therapy as being one of the possible evolutionary augmentations to to people and mental health. Part of me is curious if you have any story you'd like to share about that. Particularly, also, I'm curious, like, growing up in the 70s and 60s
and 70s, yes.
Because your perspective in this is really refreshing. How much like you bring the background of technology to this conversation, and yet you're still so ethical, and yet so curious about how do we allow for technology to coexist, but of course prioritize humans in this all. So I'm curious, like, what is your
ethics? By the way, one of the ways I define it is as well-informed self-interest, or maybe even non-obvious self-interest. But to answer your question, yes, back in the 60s, the 60s were a wonderful time, actually. There was a whole bunch of things that were wonderful in the 60s, and I indulged in some of them, and including LSD from time to time, and I felt like I got a lot out of that experience. But it was a powerful experience.
Right.
And I don't recommend it. That is, I don't recommend against it, but I say it's a sufficiently powerful experience, and it obviously depends on who you are and where you are and what's happening to you at that time. And the literature shows some people have a very, very bad time.
Yes.
And I don't think we know what makes it work and what makes it not work. I learned some very, very valuable things, and I'm not sure that I'd be able to articulate them very well, but
that's fair. So part of me is curious though, like, do you think that individuals who maybe grew up during that time, or like, does that have does it taint or impact the lens you have and why you bring ethics to the table? Or like maybe it's a relationship with your own faith or like spirituality. What is it that makes you so much more curious about the ethical side of this than just the mathematical and making money? Because your peers, right? Your peers, I mean, to an extent, some of them, they don't care about the ethics, right? And they choose to make the weapons.
So I guess I've always felt, I think the 60s was really informed by a kind of idealism that we said things should be better, and we can see ways they should be better. And let's start out by getting rid of this horrible war, but let's also just learn how to enjoy, learn how to appreciate, stop and smell the roses. And somewhere along the line, one of the things I realized was that Idealism is an exhaustible resource that if you've got some, it's actually pretty easy to use it up. And you go and you watch people, and you can see a bunch of people who have just plain used it up.
Wow.
And so they've said, oh, you know, I was idealistic in my 20s and 30s, and I've learned better now. I'm out for number one. I'm out to get what I want, and I know there's bad people out there, and I'm going to defeat them. And I'm even going to be one of them in order to make sure that I'm number one. That idealism is something that's worth protecting. If you've got some, take care of it.
Yeah. Do you think it's missing these days?
I think it is. I think a lot of that is. But I think it's also it's not missing. It may be less common.
I feel like it's not cultivated as much.
Yeah.
And I think it's easier to not cultivate it, especially when we live in an age where information is so easily accessible, and when you're constantly consuming, you don't leave that time for the stillness and the dream state that is almost necessary to be idealistic and optimistic and creative. Talking about other solutions, then, do you see AI being able to be a part of the solution, of being able to be a part of helping bring ethics back into the conversation and to help corporations maybe right their wrong, or maybe from a political standpoint or regulation standpoint, to be able to help?
I do think so, although I'm not sure that I'm a long way from having any kind of recipe for saying this is what we should build.
Come back in 10 years for the next paper.
Yeah, right. I hope to have several before that.
Yes.
I did want to say some things about surveillance.
Okay. Where do we start?
Okay. Well, you're being observed all the time, pretty much. And so they can figure out where you are because you carry around a monitor all the time. And they know where that is. And they're actually asking permission to track you with the GPS that's embedded, but they don't.
Let's define they.
They.
Well, it could be lots of different people, right?
Okay.
Organizations.
Various corporations
Okay.
that are directly associated with whatever supercomputer you happen to carry around.
Okay.
Can gather a lot of data about you. Now, that data is potentially of great value, particularly to advertisers, but perhaps to other people as well. Now, each piece of that data is very weak. It gives a very small amount of information about you. But if it's collected from a variety of different sources and aggregated and correlated, it can turn into a very strong body of knowledge about you and where you are and what you're doing and who you're with, and often what you're talking about. At the moment, the notion is, and this sort of came out of Google, that they said that there was this data exhaust that comes from the fact that there are people interacting with their search engine, typing in whatever they're interested in. And the people at Google figured out this data exhaust can be mined and turned into something of great value. Particularly since they know what your interests are, then they can sell that information to advertisers and even sell directly the rights of advertisers to post, and billions of dollars later, Google is one of the great corporations at the moment. The notion is that data exhaust, that data about you as an individual, belongs to Google. Is that right?
Well, it depends what their terms of service say, right?
Yeah, should it?
Should it belong to Google?
Does it belong to you?
The data, my data that I've created?
Yeah.
There's a line somewhere.
Somewhere, maybe.
There's a line between maybe data of where I'm, like, if I consent to it because it makes my life better.
Yeah.
I don't know. There's a line, right? Like
have you consented to it?
Often, yes. I'll give you
How?
an example.
How?
On Find My Friends or on my iPhone,
Okay.
I willingly give up my location data 100% of the time,
Okay.
in part because I want my friends to know where I am, in
Uh-huh.
part because I want to be able to track all of my other devices,
Mhm,
you know,
mhm.
and then have them close by and know.
Mhm.
And then the other, I tell myself in case of emergency.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
But the fourth, I would say, is because I actually, as a consumer, I'm okay giving up some amount of my data to optimize my life, to make
Okay.
my life easier.
Right.
I don't necessarily. I mean, even more optimal ads per se aren't always the worst thing in my mind.
Yeah, right, sure. I mean, as opposed to getting a lot of ads for things you really genuinely don't care about.
Right.
Now,
But if it hurt me, that's a different story.
yeah. Now, who gets that data?
In this case, it's Apple. In my phone,
You're pretty
but
sure?
they're selling it to others. There's social
Yeah.
media apps on my phone that are getting some level of data.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
This Aura ring I wear tracks my location as well. They're
Right.
supposed to be using it to optimize my health, but maybe they sell it.
Maybe they sell it. Yes, they sell it.
Probably they sell it.
Yes, they sell it. There may be a couple of exceptions out there, but basically, there's a data broker industry out there. And what they do is, I mean, Google can use that data for certain things. And some aspects of that, I don't mind. I mean, I often pick Amazon for this. If I buy books from Amazon, then they have a notion of what I like, and then they present me with ads for similar kinds of things. Fine. That seems entirely reasonable.
Sure.
But when Amazon takes that data and sells it to other people, sells it to a data broker, I have no idea where that data is going to go. And when they combine it with the data that comes from Google and that comes from, say, my cell phone, and I don't let them track me where I am, but they can still tell, just at lower granularity, by telling which cell tower I'm communicating through. Once a data broker has it and can combine it from many, many different sources, they can actually make a much higher quality description of where I am. And they can sell it to whoever. And then there's companies like Palantir who buy things like this for a variety of purposes that are of concern to them. And they may have to do with law enforcement. They may have to do with national defense. But the national defense for what nations? Well, probably quite a lot of them. And do I know what they're doing? Mostly no. Do I care what they're doing? Probably. If I knew more, I'd probably care more. I have consented to a variety of things by clicking on buttons that say, I accept. And it's always given me the opportunity to read the privacy statement. Very occasionally, I actually read the privacy statement. It always starts with, we care deeply about your privacy. And we will keep your information as secure as we can, except that, of course, we will honor requests from from law enforcement, and we will share it with our corporate partners, and we will do the kinds of analysis we need to do, and we'll sell it to other people and do anything else we feel like doing with it.
And there's not a lot of regulation on this.
No.
At all? Nothing changed after Cambridge Analytica?
I don't know in detail. I don't know. But I don't think very much changed.
Okay.
Now, one thing I've been advocating for, incidentally, is create an app that reads privacy policies.
And synthesizes it and...
Well, the main thing is most privacy policies are very similar to each other. And so if you can sort of categorize the space of privacy policies, and then let's say I pick up an app and I I'm going to ask my privacy policy expert, what's this one? And then it goes and it says, well, 95% of the clauses are perfectly normal and shared with almost everybody else. But this clause says that they have an option on your firstborn son. And so they can take possession at any time.
It's tough though. Part of me, I'm imagining creating this, and in my head, I'm like, well, you create like probably a Chrome extension or something like that, and then every time you go over a page. But then my next thought is, who makes this app? And they're tracking every movement on every page you make to be able to detect when there's a privacy policy and then give you the details. What are they doing with that data?
That's an interesting thing.
And then in my head, I'm like, well, they should probably be a nonprofit. And then it's like, well, that's tough. That's
and
tough
how
to get funding
nonprofit
for.
are nonprofits anyway?
Right. Well, yeah, there is that, but enough to where a company like OpenAI decides to become for profit.
Yes, right. I guess.
So the privacy policies we need better regulation on.
Yeah. Now, I think the single thing I would do on surveillance is to say, I own my data. If you create an app and you ask to use my data, I may give you the right to use my data, but what I don't do is give you the right to share it with other people. And so if you can use it, fine. My bookseller, I don't mind that they know what books I look at. I don't mind if they know what books I order, and they can recommend useful things. Of course, if they're a huge monopoly and they look at everything I buy, well, maybe they're getting a little intrusive there, but still,
Okay.
if I say you can have that information, then you can have that information. But I have given you a limited license to use my information. I have not transferred ownership, which means you can't sell it. That's going to be a popular policy, I'm sure.
Sure. I mean, among people, but not among corporations.
Yeah, that's for sure.
The lobbyists won't let that happen.
Yeah. So I mean,
but I have a comparison to draw with that, which is in education, who owns your transcript?
yeah.
The institution does.
Okay.
And so in order for you to get your transcript or get that information to your employer, to get it to
Yeah.
another whatever, you have to pay money for that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And even though you've already paid money to go and complete the courses and so on, right? They
Yeah.
own the transcript. So what's happening now is there's a couple of companies that are trying to decentralize this. The main company is Instructure that owns Canvas.
Okay. Yeah.
If you know Canvas.
Yeah.
And they are like buying up all of the different companies that own these rights to transcripts and so on the back end that I've never heard of, but the
Right.
universities employ, and trying to make it so that the student owns their transcript and then can decide when to give it out and possibly even generate income on it. It's a far out thought, but it takes a lot. And nonetheless, a corporation is trying to solve that problem because they're like, well, if we can solve the problem for the consumers and tell them we've made their lives free, now we get all this data.
Yeah.
So it seems to constantly be unethical.
Yeah. Right. Right.
So, yeah, I mean, it brings me to this question of, I think there's low trust right now in society when it comes to data, and that consumers, to an extent, have kind of thrown up their arms and said, "I don't care anymore."
Yeah. Right.
That there's nothing I can do.
So one question is, can we do something that helps? Because that communicates the notion that it is possible to do something. And then people can perhaps start to get clever about other ways to help.
Okay.
Because I am actually an enthusiast for the entrepreneurial marketplace. Because I think the notion of people coming up with clever ways to improve things and getting rewarded for it, turning into what Google has turned into,
Yes.
maybe not so fun.
In your work, you mentioned the term technomoral values that was coined by
Shannon Valor.
Shannon Valor. Do you believe that those technomoral values, is that being taught to most of these technologists that are coming up and building these futuristic companies and these big corporations? And two, is that something that you believe actually exists in the blood of any of these companies or startups today, or is this like a whole new philosophy that we need our future entrepreneurs and technologists to be thinking of?
Short answer, no.
It's not being taught.
Not being taught. The somewhat longer answer is, I met Shannon about 8 years ago at a conference that we were at and had very enjoyable conversation and read her book and stuff like this. She was at the University of Santa Clara at the time, and she's now a professor at the University of Edinburgh. What the technomoral values are is not actually a distinct set of values. It's really saying, let's take a number of the virtues that are highlighted when you're doing virtue ethics and apply them to our technological thinking. And so, I mean, she has a list, and this is only a partial list, but I mean, honesty, courage, empathy, humility, justice, care, wisdom. Those are sort of classic virtues. And I mean, Aristotle had versions of those. And her book is fascinating because, among other things, it covers other cultural approaches to virtue ethics, like Confucian ethics, which I hadn't known anything about. But what she's saying is, have humility, for example, about what your technology can do, and maybe what the negative sides of your technology might be. Have courage about your ability to change things for the better, but apply these virtues
To what you build.
to the technology that you're building. And in a sense, that's a little bit like what I'm saying, and she's saying it very well, which is, as you think ethically about your work. And if you're doing technically detailed work on some particular issue, think about the ethical aspects of that.
I asked this question in part because I'm curious, like, to me, the strong will to be ethical doesn't, I don't see that in everyone, right? And I especially oftentimes when I look at people who are running corporations, I feel like they become the corporation and the mindset of the corporation, and those ethics fall. So I'm curious, like, do you have a perspective on maybe an importance of spirituality for, for individuals to be able to have a strong ethical background or a strong sense of ethics? Do you, I'm curious, what does it take?
Now, I think that's an interesting and complicated question. And I do feel like I have a strong spiritually grounded way of thinking about the world. On the other hand, I don't think that it's necessary to have that in order for someone to believe that ethics should be important in their lives. And
because you think it can be reasoned?
To some extent, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
You can reason someone beyond greed.
Yeah. By helping them recognize that greed for accumulation of money, basically, isn't everything that you want or everything that you should understand that you should want. So if you think it is everything you need, then maybe you're not understanding it adequately. And that it is possible to understand that being ethical is in your self-interest.
That's well said.
Part of the reason we can thrive doing the things we're doing is because we live in a certain society that provides us with a whole lot of other supports. That we have a stake in that society functioning. And that if we're doing things that erode that functioning, maybe we'll be able to erode it a little and it won't hurt. But when a lot of people do that, it does hurt.
It hurts.
I like to use the example of Boeing. Boeing had a fabulous reputation for safety, for high quality engineering, for doing things right. And some number of decades ago, the management of Boeing changed for various reasons from being engineering oriented to being business oriented. And so then they started saying, well, we have to optimize our profits. Now, you can often optimize your profits by cutting corners. And you cut corners, and 95% of the time you can get away with it if you're clever. But then that 5% comes around. And when it comes around twice, it turns out you got a big problem.
Yeah.
And now, what do you think Boeing's reputation is?
Not very great.
Not very great. They may not survive. They may actually quite well not survive.
Wow.
I mean, the United States government has a real stake in Boeing's survival.
It does.
So they may prop it up.
Airlines in general, right, are very subsidized.
Yeah.
You also talk about a lot of unknown unknowns in your
yes.
work. I want to talk about that a little bit. Can you define that, like unknown unknowns in AI models?
Sure. I'll have to back up just a smidge.
Okay.
The world is infinitely complicated, right? I mean, it just is. It's way more complicated than we can understand. So the way we deal with that is we create models. And this is models in the scientific and engineering sense, but also in the common sense. And what a model is, it's saying, here is a small set of aspects of the world and relations between those aspects that I can reason about, and that this is going to answer questions about something I care about. And if it's a good model, if I make a prediction with the model, that prediction will apply pretty well to the world itself. Now, what that means is I've taken out of that infinite complexity, I've taken a small bit, and I've omitted everything else. Now, what I'm doing is I'm treating everything else as negligible. Now, negligible is a really valuable word, by the way, because it means can be neglected. It doesn't mean it's not there, but it means you can neglect it from the point of view of pursuing your model. If I consider the stuff inside the model to be the known unknowns, these are the things that I've specifically designated, and maybe I have values for some of them. Maybe I do inferences to find values for the others. I predict it over time. I do whatever it is I do. But all of that other stuff, I don't even know what stuff I'm leaving out. These are the unknown unknowns. These are the things that are left out. So now let's think a little about climate change.
Yes.
Once upon a time, if you were building a factory, you could go and take the industrial wastes and you could pour them into the river. You could burn them up into smoke and they go into the atmosphere, and the river goes down to the ocean, and the ocean is infinitely big and the atmosphere is infinitely big, and whatever stuff you're pumping out there, the natural processes of the environment will just take care of it. No problem. And that has been true for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And starting a few centuries ago, it stopped being true. And starting in the middle of the 20th century, people started to recognize that, if you put a lot of carbon dioxide and methane and stuff into the atmosphere, that's going to change the percentage of the sunlight that stays on the planet as opposed to radiating back out into space. So the planet is going to get warmer. So I read about this in the 60s and 70s, and a few hippies and weirdos and people like that paid attention to this. But
were you one of them?
Yeah, actually. Yes and yes.
Yes.
Now we recognize that no, the carrying capacity of the atmosphere and the oceans and the land are not infinite, and that we're producing a heck of a lot more than we did 500 years ago, and it's not going to get all taken care of. So something that was treated as negligible and was legitimately treated as negligible. I mean, that was a perfectly reasonable thing to do. It doesn't scale. Silicon Valley talks about scaling all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But when things, and you got to recognize when things scale, often something that used to be negligible stops being negligible, and you run into trouble. Donald Rumsfeld used to use this term about known unknowns and unknown unknowns, and it was in putting it into this model framework that I felt like I could actually understand how it very tangibly affects what we're doing.
Okay. Are you optimistic about AI's impact or potential impact on climate change?
In the long run, yes, although that probably says more about me than about this actual situation. Not sure that how big an ingredient AI is in climate change.
Mm.
I mean, there are things where the industrial processes contribute, particularly the amount of electricity used in these training computations. But the training computations are also ephemeral. I mean, that's going to happen for a few decades, and we're going to figure out better ways to do that. More importantly, our whole industrial establishment has to figure out how to solve these problems and
Right.
get climate change under control.
Which requires global cooperation.
And that's what I'm not necessarily so optimistic about.
Global cooperation.
Global cooperation and global trust. There are a number of social forces that work hard to undermine trust.
Are corporations one of them?
Corporations generally no, but some corporations are. I think there is a large business community that wants to say corporations shouldn't have to be. Well, corporations shouldn't try to cooperate for human good. It's hard to imagine any corporation or any corporate leader who would say we don't have to worry about trust, because they know they have to worry about trust. And if they don't worry about trust, they really are dead. So
Yeah. So what's in the way? What are the hindrances to global cooperation? Is there anything worth focusing on to make a global cooperation happen in your mind? It's tough. I spoke with you. I read your papers. I learned more about cooperation, and then I sat there and was like, "Well, how do we make this happen?" And then the only thing there's a few things I point to in this book, but the big one I point to is like it's mental health. It's like you got to create more empathetic people. You have to create a people that are more ethical, and I don't and that's a complex beast.
I wish we had learned more from COVID.
There's a lot of global cooperation then, right?
There was more global cooperation. It was not as good as it could have been. I think that there are people out there who are trying to get ready for the next one.
What does that mean? Like people trying to create a pandemic, or are they?
No. Not to create a pandemic, but to be
better equipped to respond.
Better prepared for a response. And again, it's not super clear that they're doing that as well as they should. There are a number of well-documented errors that cost the CDC a large amount of trust.
Right.
And I think people need to be thinking about those and saying, what do we do next? I mean, the whole back and forth about whether you wear masks, whether you don't wear masks, and the relative impact of social isolation, infectious rates, the impact on education.
But there were a lot of unknowns.
There were a lot of unknowns, huge amount of unknowns. And I think part of what you need to do to earn trust is to say, this I know, this I don't know. And I mean, today I'm going to recommend that you mask, because that's the best advice we have today. And it looks, as far as our certainty and uncertainty goes, 2-to-1 in favor of wearing the mask. But we can learn more. Maybe it's 2-to-1 the other way. And when we learn more, we'll tell you. Maybe the situation will change and it'll be 2-to-1 the other way. And I mean, that's one aspect. Then there's other aspects, which is some countries this is more how does an individual governmental agency build and maintain trust? But if you start looking across different countries, one issue is some countries felt that it was important for their national prestige to conceal the degree to which they had these infections.
Right.
And
that's not helpful for global cooperation.
That's not helpful. But on the other hand, they have real concerns that they are worried about, and there has to be, I mean, that has to be acknowledged and dealt with.
Part of me looks at these like global bodies that exist, or thinks of it, my mind goes to them, like the European Union, the United Nations.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say the EU, but more the UN. Like generally it seems people feel they're rather useless nowadays, right? Like they're not able to gain consensus, they're not able to gain global cooperation or be effective in policing very much. So yeah, I think it leaves people a little hopeless. And then also, you know, when the governments and politicians feel like a corporation, you know, they care more about their own interests than the people.
Yeah.
It's tough. So I have to ask, like, what keeps you optimistic?
You know, I ran into, well, I think I'm congenitally optimistic.
Great.
So I've got a bias. And so that will, furthermore, let's suppose I'm congenitally optimistic and you're congenitally pessimistic.
Okay.
Who's got a happier life?
Yours. Yeah. I mean, it's
your choice.
It's nicer to live.
I mean, no.
I'm just like you. I live in the same boat. I'm delusionally optimistic.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Because part of me believes you have to create that world.
You have to create that world.
Idealism,
I think that's
like
exactly right.
Yeah.
That you have to be idealistic. But, you know, the other day I watched a TED Talk and got excited because, and you may, the issue was pointing out that you can actually make a significant difference to the way politics works in a particular state if instead of having winner-take-all partisan primaries,
you rank the votes.
You have the rank-ordered primaries. So California, I don't know if they rank order, but it's the top 2 vote getters.
I didn't know we were ranking in California.
I don't think you're ranking. I think it's just votes, but it's nonpartisan.
Interesting.
And so you can have 2 Democrats or 2 Republicans running against each other for the seat. But this one, it's Andrew Yang, since you're obviously
in Michigan?
familiar. No,
in California, the one you're following.
No. Actually, he's arguing that this is the TED Talk.
Oh, he's a speaker.
Yeah, the TED Talk. But he was saying in Alaska, they started a movement to create the ranked choice primaries. And they got it through, and it took full effect in 2022. And Sarah Palin got a chance to stay home and spend time with her family.
That's funny.
And Lisa Murkowski got a chance to go back and serve another 6-year term as senator in the Senate.
How interesting.
How interesting. So,
Maine does this as well, I'm told.
and Nevada is apparently in the process of doing it.
Interesting. This feels like cultural evolution.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and California actually made a substantial, I think it was a redistricting change, that completely changed the dominance in the legislature. And Michigan did that actually starting about 4 or 5 years ago.
Okay.
So I've been supporting redistricting efforts for a long time, and now I want to support this too. It seems like there are a lot of grassroots. Do you call that grassroots? Sort of. A lot of efforts to solve individual problems that can make things better.
That's great. Okay, my one final question I suppose I'll leave you with, unless some come up along the way.
Yeah.
But looking back at your career, what
Yeah.
do you think is the most important lesson you've learned when it comes to the future of technology and building the future of technology?
I'm not sure that I have something I can point to. I feel like I've been learning a lot of stuff year by year all along. And I feel like probably the most important personal lesson is to stay idealistic.
Yeah.
And a fair amount of my idealism is around the notion of science. That, not all of it by a long shot, but the notion that our understanding of the world, the infinitely complex world, our society's understanding of that is this gigantic collective artifact that we as scientists and citizens and all sorts of other people are building, and that it depends on doing good science. And that has a lot to do with trust. It has a lot to do with saying the truth and being trusted to say the truth. So if you're a scientist and you're publishing papers and you get caught lying about your data in one of those papers, that's a professional death sentence.
Yeah.
You are cooked.
Yeah.
So, and that's one of the ways that science protects itself. And I think we can do similar things. I mean, if you look at the Constitution of the United States, which these guys were system theorists. They said, we are working with imperfect components, flawed, greedy, corrupt. And what we need to do is to find a way to make a successfully functioning society. And they made a lot of good choices. They made a fair number of really stupid choices.
Right.
And we've paid for them with pain and blood and death. Right. But
Systems thinkers.
They were systems thinkers.
Yeah.
And so I think as we think about how to make our society succeed, I mean, artificial intelligence is one of the technologies that we've created, and it seems to be a particularly impactful one. There's a lot of exciting possibilities.
And do you have like that sci-fi brain? Do you watch all the content and imagine a world of going and colonizing Mars?
Yeah. One of the great disappointments I really knew as I was growing up, when I was a kid in middle school reading piles of science fiction books, that I was certainly going to be able to go to the moon, almost certainly be able to go to Mars. Maybe I'd be able to explore the moons of Jupiter.
Wow.
You never know. Could be we would have an interstellar drive in time for me to take it.
It could happen.
But it didn't.
But it could.
Yes.
They could, and
Yep.
it could be part of the section of my book is transhumanism, and it's
Yeah,
this
right.
school of philosophy which is partially controversial as well, but
Mm-hmm.
the idea that we can use tech and biology to augment human bodies to be
Yeah.
able to live maybe even twice our life expectancy in the next couple of centuries,
Yeah.
engineering organs and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So you never
What
know.
do you think of Mustafa Suleiman's book?
Oh, yes. The next wave was very... so he talks about this biology and genetic
Yeah.
editing and,
Yeah.
and so on. I
But
actually
his
love this
major-
book.
His major focus was on AI. Now, I
His
haven't
major
finished
focus
it.
is AI. And his major focus on AI is kind of dark, in my
Yeah.
opinion. It's
Yeah.
not as optimistic.
Yeah.
So I think the work is important for him to come out and say what he wrote.
Yeah.
But when I think of like my own writing and just
Yeah.
being a young person in the world who doesn't come
Yeah.
from that, I feel like I have to be that idealistic, optimistic, solution-oriented.
Yeah.
Because he paints some solutions of like how it's good and will evolve, but he's also very doomsday-esque.
Yeah. Well,
I'm excited for you to finish.
yeah, right. I'm about a third of the way through, so
Yeah.
it'll be a while. Actually, I didn't like *Sapiens*.
You didn't like *Sapiens*?
No. Again, I thought he was too dark for me,
Too dark.
and I didn't read *Homo Deus*.
Right.
So
Yeah.
Deus.
I do feel like much of the content that comes out is quite dark. The sci-fi films are dark.
Yeah.
It almost feels like no one is painting utopistic pictures. Like I
Yeah.
think of the Jetsons type.
Yeah, right.
But
Right.
it's been a while since that type of content.
Yeah.
Even Her, did you see that film?
Yeah.
Falls in love with the AI.
Yeah.
They're all pretty dark.
Well, the AI goes off to a nice future.
The AI goes off to a nice future.
She and her friends decide to take off.
Incredible.
Right.
Thank you so much
certainly.
for taking the time,
Yes.
so much time to go through all of this in great detail with me.
Great.
I think it'll be very valuable for people.
Great. Fantastic.